That's because I'm talking louder. Anyway, I've been here a year and a half ago. Maybe some of you were in the room then. I always start by the same excuse. I need to warn you, I am Dutch, which means my English is very poor, and my diplomatic skills are even worse. So, depending on where the passion flows, anything could happen this afternoon. It's great to be here. I think this is the best university in the world. You think that too, otherwise you wouldn't be here, I guess. But and we're very, very excited about doing more and more work together with the schools and the global business community. It fits extremely well in the trend of this time. Most days these days I sound rather optimistic, and that's not because I think the deal in Paris will solve all climate issues or the SDGs are the most brilliant piece of work ever produced. But the spirit of collaboration that has opened up is truly new. I'm very new to the sustainability circus, as I call it. I've been, like Brad said, I was CEO until 4 years ago of a large global company. I've been to 3 COPs, and every time I left 1 or 2 days earlier than I had planned, and I was totally convinced to never ever come back, because this is the most dysfunctional process to solve anything, let alone the big global climate crisis. But last year in Peru, in Lima, the Peruvian government actually started the, well, it's now called the Lima to Paris Action Agenda. So in the past, if you've not been to a COP is the name for the climate negotiation meeting. If you haven't been, there's 20,000 people flying in from all around the world to talk about climate change. That's already quite funny, and normally it's in faraway places that you would never consider visiting for any other reason. And then we sit there and we talk about climate change, and business will meet in 5-star hotels, and we call it side events. And the negotiators, the government representatives, will sit in, it could be a football stadium, could be a hangar on an airport in rather poor places, negotiating, and the 2 groups never meet, which is rather silly. This year, for the first time, it started a bit in Peru, but now it's being institutionalized in Paris. Business and cities, the other main change agent in the world, the implementation agents, are actually invited inside the tent. So rather than in side events, CEOs are being invited to come and talk about what are the solutions that are going to work, and city mayors are getting the same invites. And I think that's a great development. Similarly, in the SDGs, if you look at the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessor of the Sustainable Development Goals, they were never really designed with business or any other actors than governments in mind. They were just government-to-government conversations, and therefore they didn't get the real pickup that they needed in society. SDGs from the start have been designed for non-state actors, cities and mayors in particular, to be part of the implementation agents. And that's, I think, is what makes me optimistic, that finally collaboration is happening. And collaboration between business and academia is another important strand, for 2 reasons. This is where science houses. This is where the best knowledge about the world, the environment, or social aspects is being gathered. Let's make that completely available in a functional way to the people who have to make business decisions. Secondly, this is where the leaders of the futures are being trained. And I'm quiet at this point in time. I remember being here last year. I think the business school building or something was being opened over there across the street. And I was saying, it's really stupid these days to open a glass building, because we're literally 2 years away from people walking down the streets with bricks in their hands, and they'll be throwing them at leading institutions like yours and businesses around the world, because people are just fed up with the lack of change. I can't say that of this building, but I could see it go on fire. So I don't think we're safe yet. Anyway, so I am extremely relieved that everybody in the UN, I mean, if you go to New York this week, if you go listen to the Pope, if you go listen to Mr. Ban Ki-moon or any of the other dignitaries coming out, everybody will be talking about the historic year 2015, where all of a sudden all of us came to realize that the world is in trouble and we need the SDGs to save us, or the climate agreement to bail us out. And I'm so relieved that everybody thinks that, because that means we can stop talking about it. We don't need to debate anymore whether it's the Millennium Development Goals 2 or the post-2015 development goals. We've now agreed, or formally 2 days from now, we will agree that it's going to be the Sustainable Development Goals. Who knows what Goal 4 is?
I have a cheat sheet if you want.
Say what? Who knows what Goal 1 is?
I'm sure it's poverty.
Wow.
Gotta be eradicated.
Anyway, the SDGs haven't made it to Yale yet, I can tell. Anyway, we have a framework. There are 17 goals. So poverty, ending hunger, health for everybody. I mean, my English is too limited to remember all these difficult sentences, but it's education for all, gender equality, access to clean energy, cities. There's a broad agenda, 17 goals. Underlying those 17 goals, there are 169 targets, so almost 10 targets per goal. And that is a framework that the world leaders, all the governments in the world, 195 I think they are now, will agree this coming Friday is the global agenda for development of our societies. It is universally applicable. It works in all corners of the world, different priorities in different parts of the world, of course, but this is the agenda that we all need to implement. And this has taken 3-4 years of negotiations, and we're 2 days away or 3 days away from those negotiations coming to an end and everybody celebrating the historic fact that we have come to an agreement. They are far from perfect. There are many things you could say. I mean, even up until 8 months ago, the debates in the UN system were fierce whether climate should or should not be one of the goals, which is of course ridiculous, because how can it not be one of your goals? And it is. It's unfortunately for those who believe in those things, it's number 13, which is a bad sign, but okay, it's in. Maybe it's a good sign because it's the worst one of the worst ones for sure. Anyway, why I'm relieved is we're at the edge now of stopping to talk about what should be on the agenda, and we will move into how are we going to implement the solutions to deliver the agenda. So if 2015 is going to be a historic year and remembered as such for agreeing climate or SDGs or whatever else we agree, let's try to make 2016 and beyond the year of implementation. And let's all only talk about what are the solutions and how do we scale them up as fast as we can. That's really all we need to talk about. We know we have problems, you know. Every 6 seconds, a child dies from hunger. Another child has just died. I can do this all day. 18,000 children die each day from hunger. Children dying from hunger. It's a disgrace. But I've been saying this because I learned this 7 years ago. And 7 years ago it was every 7 seconds. Now it's every 6 seconds. Why? Because the Middle East is on fire. And whole new groups of millions of people are pushed into hunger. It's a tragedy. But we don't need to describe anymore that there's 1.8 billion people who don't have access to energy, 2 billion people who don't have access to water and sanitation. Every 6 seconds a child dying. We all know. Let's now talk about the solutions. Let's talk about how we scale them up. So I'll give you one example and then my 5 minutes are way gone. Climate change is one of the most urgent and pressing environmental issues, as you all know. If we want to stay below 2 degrees of warming, which I will just warn you, this is not going to be a pleasant world, 2 degrees warmer. This is going to be a world with lots of changes in sea levels, in storms, in droughts, and migration of millions of people already. But that's still what the science is telling us could be a safe operating space. What are the solutions? We've now built, with almost 200 companies, 9 big solutions. And they've, for the first time, focused on sectors. So what can cement do to reduce? What can chemicals do? What can the climate-smart agriculture? How can we use forests as carbon sinks? How can we make buildings more energy efficient? What can the fossil fuel boys do about CCS, carbon capture and storage, renewable energy? All these topics are in there. Mobilizing businesses around those, asking ourselves 3 questions. What is the potential impact if we scale this up? What are the barriers to scale? Is it money, technology? Is it research? Is it policy? And what are the companies about to implement? And every company, every institution, I was just chasing up Brad, there's always 2 questions that anyone needs to ask itself. What can I, in my building, or my campus, or whatever you call this thing, do to make it more energy efficient, more clean? And the second thing is, how can I train students, in this case, to have massive impact in all the jobs they're going to do in all the companies and change the world as a result of that? And every company can, Siemens had a great story yesterday about making their own plants greener, but that's side effect, boys. It's about what can your technology do to make the energy providers in the world get to cleaner energy faster. That's a much bigger impact. So we're going to move to a world where we talk solutions, where we will measure the impacts, where we will integrate it into the accounting systems, into the governance of companies, and then we will start to accelerate. We will make heroes of the companies that do well. We will shame the people who don't do well, and I'm sure somebody will argue where Volkswagen should fit in that picture.
Not much of an argument.
And then you should ask me in the questions, is Volkswagen a member of yours, and see what happens. It's kind of fun. Anyway, so I think it's incredibly exciting times. The talk is over. Anyone who is still talking, and we're in the USA. I was invited to give a briefing in the White House yesterday on this program that we do with these 9 solutions. And I started my presentation saying the great thing about being in the White House is that I do not need to argue the science underlying climate change anymore. Because science is now clear, it's indisputable, climate is changing, we are at fault, we must now act, and this program is how we're going to act. And then this poor man from the staff of the White House said, I wish that was true. Depending on which department of government I call, I still meet quite a few climate deniers. So that's sad, because please, I'm European, I have a beard, I know all that stuff, but do not let yourself be fooled by anyone on your television screens. Climate science is completely indisputable. And if we do not make a deal this year, if we don't start changing rapidly this year, this week, then we're just never going to stay under 2 degrees. And we're going to create a world that, and it's, most people end their speeches saying, I'm doing this for my children and my grandchildren. Well, please don't think that, because in our lifetimes, even in this old lifetime of mine, we will suffer the consequences. It's 10 years away, 20 years away, that the first real bad things will happen. And we must act now. So whatever you take away from this little talk, think and do only one thing, and that is, what are the solutions? How do we scale them up? And how do we keep the ones who are in leading positions accountable for what they have done?
Thank you, Peter. Great start to the panel discussion. I think, would people hold their questions, I think, till we have everybody have a chance to weigh in on aspects of this. Francis, where would you like to take us next?
So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Brad. I agree with Peter completely. I think this is a hugely important moment. As the action plan says, the future of humanity and the planet lie in our hands, and I think that's all of us here in this room and all who are engaged in these issues. There's been a tremendous amount of work going into designing the SDGs. They're not great, but they do cover the issues. And I think what's happening both around the Sustainable Development Goals and around COP21 is what we at NRDC call a new architecture, that whereas in earlier conversations around UN forums on climate or on sustainable development, they were around countries. The conversation was among the countries, particularly between the developed world and the developing world. What are the countries' responsibility? And to Peter's point, what's really happened, I think, since Copenhagen, is that this is a conversation that every sector is involved in. The countries have a really important role to play, and nobody should minimize that. But every other sector, and the sectors are represented here, the business sector, the NGO sector, the faith sector, academia, everyone has a role to play to advance these. We need to both accelerate the change that we're seeing. We're setting the goals. We don't have the technology available now to reach those goals, particularly, I think, in the energy sector. There has to be a major investment. That major investment has to come from the private sector. As the acceleration occurs, as the commitments are made, and one thing I think that's great is that there's a real opportunity to document and record the commitments that are being made by the cities and the companies, and the UNFCCC as a portal that documents all that. Actually measuring the impact and having accountability for whether those goals are reached. I think that one thing that I know in my sector, the NGO sector, the concern is always how much of that is real. You know, it's great to get up there. I remember at UN Week last year, everybody got up and made a lot of commitments towards what they would do in the energy sector to unleash clean energy and reduce their own carbon footprint. That needs to be documented, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be verified both in the companies and in the cities and in the countries. You know, we need a system of transparency and verification that's built in, but I think it's a hugely important part of this. And just to Brad's point, because he knows I'm going to say this, you know, yesterday Siemens had an op-ed and they told you all the great things that they're doing. Peter said it's not enough, but because what they need to do is advance their technology, just not reduce their footprint. But also yesterday, you know, the story burst that Volkswagen has basically been lying to the consumer, the shareholder, and the regulator, and that there are 11 million cars on the road that are spewing 40 times the pollution that they, at least in the United States, are allowed to put out there. And this is a leading global company that has, I mean, you know, I was in college, we drove around in VW buses. I mean, this is a company that people generally like. And who could, I said to Peter, I want him to tell me, he doesn't know yet, but who could have decided that they would design a cheating mechanism so that when the car was being tested for their emissions, it would show one thing, but on the road it would show another? I mean, how can we have any confidence if we don't have a system of verification and accountability and oversight? And I think, you know, I've spent a career in the environmental sector where we believe government oversight is a hugely important role to play. This is a, you know, a constant tension between the business community and the NGOs and the government regulators. If there's any hero in this story, it's EPA doing its job, despite the fact that they are under constant assault by the United States Congress for overreaching. Are they overreaching when they find out that one of the largest companies in the world is basically lying to them and lying to 11 million consumers and their shareholders? I mean, I just find this, I have to say, nothing shocks me. I used to say, this totally has shocked me. And I think that, unfortunately, for all of the companies that are making commitments and really trying very hard to be part of a global process to make serious advances on global warming, on human development and well-being, when one company comes up and totally games the system, it puts a question mark on the whole sector. And I think that, you know, for all of us to try to understand the lessons learned from this and how the business community engages with the public on transparency and accountability, they have tremendous resources. And we absolutely need the know-how, the commitment, and the innovation that the business community brings to these issues. Government cannot do this. But we also have to have confidence that what they're telling us is actually what's happening. And I think that's where the not-for-profit community and that's where the regulatory parts of government come into play, so that we have a system that everybody trusts and that they have the opportunity to really not only be profitable while they're creating the technologies that move us in this very accelerated way to decarbonize the economy and move to a very, very different future. So this has to be a partnership, but it has to be a trusting one, and we have to figure out how to design a system that allows that to happen. I think we're actually getting there. If it hadn't been for Volkswagen, I would be a lot more enthusiastic and optimistic, but I'm just kind of thrown back on my heels at this moment to think, oh my gosh, here who else is out there who might be doing this? And I think, so I hope there's nobody else out there doing this, but I think that this is, this is why we need a system that where everybody is part of the conversation and everybody has access to the data and the information. That it's a very transparent system. It's one that is built to allow all the participants to ensure both that we're moving forward, but that what we actually say we're doing is the result that we're getting. Because in the end, all the commitments that are being made, and they're significant, there are trillions of dollars of commitments being made to address the issues around carbon emissions and the Sustainable Development Goals. But verification of those is, I think, just critically important. And I think that is good, too, because one of the things is you can make a commitment, and maybe it's possible to reach it, maybe it's not. Actually, I was in a meeting last week on Yale's next sustainability plan, and there was a discussion about should we have goals that are far-reaching even if we don't now know the path to get there. Yes, we should, because in order to reach 2 degrees, we have to have those goals, and we have to figure out what the path to get there is. And if we don't know it today, we got to figure out what the answer to that is. So bold goals are really important. Part of that will be that some of the strategies will not succeed. That's a learning experience, too. That's why transparency, I think, is absolutely essential, because we're going to learn from the things that do work, and we're going to learn from the things that don't. And the more people that know about that, the more minds there will be put to work to find the solutions that are so essential for the future well-being of humanity. So I think this is a hugely important 3-month period, these SDG adoption, and then COP21, because it's a global conversation that we're all part of, and you all will have an enormous opportunity in the careers that you're going forth in to be a very significant player in how this all plays out going forward. Because Peter said, and I completely agree, I'm really interested in January and February. Once this all is adopted, what's next? How to make it happen. I think that's when the really interesting work begins, when the negotiation about what the agreement stops and the agreement is in place, and now we have to make it happen. That's the part that's going to be really interesting, and that is what I hope you will all be engaged in, because it's going to take everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Pavan, you've been looking a lot at corporations and the future of corporations and thinking about how to bring these some wider, more public values into the activities of businesses. Where would you like to take the conversation from here?
Well, I think I'd like to begin where people suggest are the answers, and maybe spend a few moments, if I can get some slides on the investor statistics up on the screen, to explain why some people think that. And then maybe I'll make an attempt to pick a few holes in that argument, my own argument, so to speak, and explain perhaps where we should be heading, which leads to the world of ethics and the Pope. Yeah, I want to say that the work that I did on a book which was called Corporation 2020 was actually it happened here at Yale, and I'm grateful to my many students, actually a team of 8 who did drafts of different pieces of research. We came out with essentially a recommendation for key areas of change on the supply side, on the demand side, and aspects such as taxation and accountancy, reporting performance, and looking at advertising and its level of transparency and accounting in a real sense. So it was interesting, and I was left feeling that the usual hope that people have in investors is unfounded until I got these statistics recently. So I was kind of more pinning my hopes on, if you like, internalization of externalities by design rather than by decree. And then I saw these numbers saying, my God, look at how much hope these numbers give you. This is a set of statistics prepared by someone, a group of organizations called the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, pulling together data from different countries on investments which are termed ESG or SRI, environmental, social, and governance investments, or socially responsible investment. A couple of things about these numbers. Firstly, there's a huge growth in terms of companies, debt, and equity which are classified as sustainable in these broad categories. Growth from 13 trillion to 21 trillion, and just to give you a sense of scale, at 21 trillion, this is almost 10% of global financial assets, which means 160 trillion of debt and about 60 odd trillion of equities. That sounds like great news, that, you know, not only as of now do we have almost a tenth of global assets being classified as socially responsible in some way or the other, but also that the growth has been almost 30% per annum over the last 2 years. The next slide shows us that the strategies by which people evaluate are also signs of hope, in the sense, not only are people looking at negative screening, in other words, looking at problems such as the Volkswagen problem as a way of cutting out certain names from this calculus, but they're also looking at other strategies like integrated reporting, and are we integrating values at the time when we report performance, and are we looking at corporate engagement and shareholder action and aspects of that. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see a few statistics there which indicate that to this day shareholders are still dissatisfied, because what they're saying is that we still need quantitative indicators. This is not good enough. They're still saying that, that's 96% of them saying that. 92% are saying we still need more integration across these different dimensions of performance, social, environmental, as well as financial. And the majority are saying that we do want standards for reporting. So this is all good news by the sound of it. Some time back, I learned that Telia, a large Swedish telecom group, had finally made a decision to pull out of Eastern Europe because there was just too much corruption. So they'd been under pressure by various NGOs to pull out, and they had decided for a long time not to because of the potential for losing business and the potential, therefore, for a loss in their share value. Sure enough, everyone forecasted when they made this decision that the stock markets would punish their stock because they would make less profits. The exact opposite happened. Suddenly the stock went up about 5% as a result of this ethical decision. And to me, I attribute it to this class of investors who are saying, oh, finally we can put this big company and its massive size of stock into our yes box. And so finally we can buy some of this. Go ahead, let's buy. And sure enough, you have the reaction you have. When Volkswagen loses 20% because of a profit-seeking activity which has cost its reputation, then the market drops 20% in Volkswagen. So all this sounds as if it's in the right direction. But what worries me about all this is that these investor responses are not going to finally solve the problem. And the reason is this. Even if you have, let's say, this issue of stranded assets, and will stranded assets finally make oil companies get out of oil and gas? No, because they are amongst the best capitalized. And even if not a single person is investing who is a large, sort of equipped institutional investor in oil and gas, they still have enough capital to keep drilling. What will change that, perhaps, is oil prices. And I'll be doing a blog about what that will do to shale and the oil sands of Canada, among other things. But the reality is that it's not the investors that will, those pressures that will actually change corporate behavior. We have to look somewhere deeper inside. And I think we have to look at ethics as basically a center stage or a field on which business needs to perform. And that again takes you to the world of the church. And let's hear what the Pope has been saying about this, because I think this is really, in my opinion, perhaps the most important new force that has come into play, where you have the head of the Catholic Church, in a sense, saying that for logical reasons, I see this as an ethical problem, I see this as a moral problem, I see this as a responsibility of every woman, man, and child to respond in their own way to the reality that we need to care for the earth. The earth is our only home. And he's phrased it really well, and I've got a few quotations, but I'd like to begin by quoting my teacher. I learned a few things when I was young. One of my teachers is Dr. Townsend, who is now the headmaster of a school in England called Winchester. And he used the Pope's encyclical in his closing speech at the school, and I'll quote from a couple of things that he said, which I think rung true to me. Firstly, on the criticism that the Pope's encyclical has received from industry and commentators, and you can read the New York Times if you're interested, you'll see it there. He says that, I quote him, that it's not insignificant that those critical voices denying that climate change as a human cause are most often closely associated with free market ideology. And he goes on to describe what the Pope is trying to do with this encyclical, to say that Pope Francis merges his ecological analysis with the traditional concerns of Christian social teaching, which are about poverty and squalor and inequality that follows when market forces are unbridled and when greed effectively drives everything. And the Pope is trying to relate this not just to the environment or the natural environment, also to inequality and social injustice. And Ralph Townsend says it beautifully, as he used to when I was young. He says he wants to integrate questions of justice into debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And these are thoughts from an educator, and I think we need to listen. We need to listen to who's speaking and to who's responding here. It's the church and the educator who are responding, I think, in the right way, on an ethical plane, responding to the challenge of the environment and the challenges of society. And I think there's a lesson here to be drawn by private business, which is that you can continue to pursue private profits ad nauseum, and you can continue to keep your theoretical shareholder happy. But at the end of the day, that's not an acceptable social response. It's not an acceptable environmental response. And I think we need to change. And that brings me to my final point, which is if you want to change, and if you want to perform actions which results in change, then you mustn't do that without anything resembling a proper measurement system. And that's where I think, and I think Peter knows this, is there is some good news that we have something called the Natural Capital Coalition, which is now writing a document called the Natural Capital Protocol, which will come out next year, which is a kind of uniform guidance. It kind of responds to the demands of the investors, which is they want quantitative performance indicators. They want a global standard. So that is happening. The World Business Council is involved in that. I'm involved as an advisor. And even more, this process is going beyond just looking at environmental factors. It is possible to evaluate a company's externalities today. It is possible to work out in economic and social terms what a company has done by way of improving education and training and adding to human capital, worsening the impacts on society by destroying, if you like, small businesses or destroying social fabric in the process of their operation, or creating social capital by creating alternative communities within its value chain and within its customers, its suppliers, and in society. It is possible to evaluate environmental impacts. And one of my clients, in full disclosure, called AkzoNobel, which is a Swedish-Dutch chemical company, has actually gone through with a full evaluation of its impacts. And that's, I think, my next slide, or the last slide, which shows what they did for their pulp and performance chemicals division in Brazil, 7 factories, where they evaluated all of their environmental and social and human and financial capital impacts and have published them in indicating with both direction signs and numbers. And please note, this company has the wisdom not to try to net off its impacts on human capital with its impacts on financial capital, not try to net off the environment against society. They're representing them as different dimensions of this company's performance. So the excuses are over. There is no more time for excuses. This can be done. It has been done. It's sitting there up in front of you. It's on their website. Just Google Axo Nobel 4D PNL, and you'll get this from their website. These are the kind of change drivers, these are the kind of levers that I think we need to embrace and execute with speed. And when I wrote Cooperation 2020, my point was that this idea of measuring and disclosing externalities is one of the 4 key levers that we can pull, and that it needs to happen by 2020. 2020 was not a vision 2020, it was an action 2020. It was by 2020 we must do these things. Well, we are now 2015, so that gives me hope that if a company can do what is required in terms of proper performance reporting, and if regulators can pick this up under their governance SDG, and if they can leverage this, and there are lots of ifs, and if accountancy regulators can respond by making the disclosure of this necessary, then yes, a huge change is possible. A huge change is possible. My compatriot and author of The God of Small Things wrote many beautiful things. One of those, I think, was a sentence which I still remember. She said that a new world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you. Arundhati Roy, that is. Yeah.
Thank you. Mary Evelyn, we have you on a business panel. The panel's been singing music to your ears, I suspect.
Well, you know, it's very interesting, because I was going to get up with this slightly apologetic tone. Well, my father was a corporate lawyer in New York, in a large firm. My brother is head of Chubb Insurance in New York, and we talk climate change all the time. But after this panel, I don't have to apologize for going in the direction of values and ethics, which I think we all share. And, you know, this is actually the best, I think, of academia that can convene, as in many other settings, but a variety of points of view and say these are all necessary. Not one is sufficient altogether. So I'm addressing this question that we're all concerned about of leveraging change and suggesting, as we know, that climate science isn't quite communicating, as we heard yesterday from Heidi Cullen, and climate policy is deadlocked, as we've heard from Peter. So the suggestion is world religions have something to offer. The majority of world's people are part of these traditions, but also the papal encyclical that has been launched, and tomorrow we're going to hear this amazing address in Congress, that there's a comprehensive appeal in that encyclical, not just for climate change and action, but for ecological conversion. It's a very comprehensive document. Now, I want to be the first to say the problems of religion are vast. We know them, but the promise are also significant: large numbers of people, moral and institutional power. And the scaling up for what's happening now with the Pope has been occurring for at least 2 decades. There's a field of religion and ecology. There's a force in the larger society. And this Forum on Religion and Ecology that's located here, thanks to Gus Speth, is about 20 years old. But I want to mention the partnership now is opening up to education. The Jesuits, who have 280 universities and many high schools, 2,000 high schools around the world, are putting into practice their concerns for all of these environmental issues, but with a moral basis as well, just as Pavan indicated. Now, so we've got the field moving forward, but the force, those of us who were there last fall for the climate march, many FESers, could see that 10,000 people from the religious community came into that march, and literally the march had to stop as those religious leaders joined. It was an amazing moment. Now, here into this mix comes the papal encyclical, and I'm suggesting it's coming into fertile ground, and what you are seeing now and in the next few days in Washington and New York and Philadelphia is unbelievable. We have to say why. And again, Pavan indicated a bit of that. But I want to back up here and say the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew from the Greek Orthodox Church for 20 years has been working on these issues. And the Pope, throughout bringing out the encyclical, says this is an ecumenical moment for all the churches to come together on these issues. We were on many seminars with the patriarch. He was calling this crimes against creation, ecological sin. So the Pope is building on Bartholomew. Now, we know the audience is incredible here, 1 billion plus Catholics and 2 billion Christians altogether, but the other religious communities are coming on board. You know, today is Yom Kippur, and we need to acknowledge this amazing diversity of people. The statement of 400 rabbis is stunning, as is this Islamic statement that came out in Istanbul just a few weeks ago. So the goals of the encyclical are certainly short-term. You know, we've got the climate talks in Paris. We've got the talk tomorrow morning in the Congress, which is historic, never happened before. We've got the UN talk on Friday. This is a historic moment. Again, I underscore his concern, and he says it in this encyclical over and over again, ecological conversion of people around the planet. This is long-term and sustained change. Now, the content, we had a wonderful class with Dan Esty the other day, who's doing a great class on sustainability, and we were talking about, so what's a worldview shift? What is integral ecology? You see, many of us here are concerned about the science and the policy, but he's saying it's got to be people and planet, what many of you in the next generation are concerned about. So the ethical challenges of climate change are, yes, environmental degradation, but also climate justice, how this is affecting people in nations around the world, especially on shorelines. So very quickly, there's an interesting structure to this encyclical. He starts with the problems, and we all have the litany. But again, it's the state of the world. It's pollution, it's waste, and climate change. It's water and biodiversity. And he's trying to get us to think about these in a way that ignites reverence and respect. So he's saying we need the scientific understanding of degradation and poverty. But then he takes this step back and he says, what's the promise here? What's the possibility of our entering into this long-term change? He says, the beauty of the universe, a sense of harmony of creation, the interdependence of all creatures, drawing on St. Francis, he's the first pope to take the name of St. Francis. So he says the natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity. He's lifting this up into a level that can inspire all of us, I think. Then he goes into this very critical analysis, which I hope we can talk about a little more. So economic growth and progress without limits. What has been the result of that? Limits to growth, a report that was dismissed years ago. Is that on the agenda again? Market capitalism and the technocratic paradigm, what he calls the waste economy. He's saying, what are we thinking of when we waste food and so many other things? The excessive human-centeredness and the relativism of values. Now, anthropocentrism is something we'll talk about forever, but he's trying to say, how do we recenter ourselves as part of a community of life? That nature is not a dead object. This is the switch here. This is a living earth community. And he brings back this long Catholic social teaching about workers and the exploitation of workers. We saw that in Food First, and in many concerns, it's about the whole. And we need, then, a new synthesis. He says, okay, what's the answer? Now, again, he's got a lot of humility because he's saying these are big problems. But he is suggesting the integration of ecology, economics, and equity is what we need to think about. And I think we all are. That's the timeliness of this encyclical. He also brings in cultural ecology. This is one of the things we've loved talking to Pavan over the years, his love of India and the music and so on. These are living inheritances. This is what we've been trying to do, bringing forward in the religion and ecology, the cultural values of people for nature and for other humans. The solidarity with the poor, he's bringing liberation theology straight from Latin America, as well as intergenerational justice. The appeal, as Peter noted, and I don't think it can be said enough, Francis has grandchildren now. What is the appeal for next generations on intergenerational equity and justice? So, as Pavan said, this is expanding Catholic social teaching from people to the earth in an integral way. Then he says dialogue, exactly what we're doing today. It has to be international. These conferences, yes, they're kind of awkward and they don't seem to make progress, but But I would suggest in the last 20 years since Rio and plus, we are creating a sense of community, working towards a common home. And that's with all the messiness of this. So he's saying politics and economy have got to think of human fulfillment, not just the bottom line. Redefining progress in the ways that green business can do and is doing. And religion and science have got to get it together for this sense of our common home. So we need this kind of interdisciplinary cooperation. And finally, he says, okay, ecological education, what this school is devoted to, is at the heart of what the encyclical is about. And a new ecological spirituality, this new synthesis, which he has this great phrase. He says, this yearning for new synthesis is almost like a mist coming through the door. People are longing for something that brings together this kind of conversation, this kind of energy that we all share for future generations. So he says this is a new lifestyle, this is going to be hard, but every time this comes up and people say sacrifice, we don't want to do this, and so on, anyone who has a child, and we don't, but we consider our students our children, but anyone who has a child and has had late nights and the agony of children, sacrifice is part of who we are as humans, right? It's there. People did it during the Second World War, Victory Gardens, and so on. So this new covenant of humans and nature, this ecological conversion, he's saying this authentic call of humanity for a new synthesis. And I would suggest, again, there's background into which this is settling. The Earth Charter came out of the Rio Conference, the Earth Summit in '92. This one of the first attempts to integrate this discussion of environment and development. And at that time, Gorbachev said, we need a moral covenant to guide us forward. Well, this took 10 years to develop the Earth Charter. I hope you'll take a look at it if you haven't. But here's what's interesting about it, and again, how it ties to the encyclical. It begins with this sense, we're part of a vast and evolving universe. Earth, our home, is alive. And I was part of the drafting committee. I was at Rio in '97, 5 years into this draft. And when indigenous peoples heard that preserved in the draft, namely that this is a living Earth community, they were weeping because they felt their worldview had never been represented. On the other hand, the evolving universe is a scientific understanding and was put into the charter by an astrophysicist from Tufts. What the Charter's talking about and what the encyclical is talking about is ecological integrity is essential. It's why we need the NRDCs of this world and the EPAs when they're on their best behavior to preserve that complexity of ecology and ecosystems, what many of you are studying. But we also need social and economic justice, what many of us are concerned about. And we need institutions of democracy, of nonviolence, and peace. All of those are crucial. So I'll end here with the vision of the Earth Charter, which New Gen has just picked up, Stan Strayer's group, and this is quoted in the encyclical. It also has an appeal to New Gen, next generation. As never before in history, common destiny beckons us to seek a new beginning. Let ours be a time remembered for the awakening of a new reverence for life, the firm resolve to achieve sustainability, the quickening of the struggle for justice and peace, and the joyful celebration of life. That's a bit of what the Pope is bringing forward, and tomorrow is going to be an amazing day to see how that plays itself out. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Evelyn. Great job, panelists, getting us kicked off really well here. I have one question for Peter, and then maybe give each of you an opportunity to ask each other questions if you want, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Will we have microphones going around? Got microphones. All right. So Peter, yeah, you didn't really have a chance to talk about how the WBCSD and its member companies are thinking about the encyclical. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. No, let's focus on that question, because I have a lot to say after what you said.
I figured I would go there.
No, let me just say one thing. I mean, I always, it's probably my Dutch culture, we always balk when people are made into heroes. And I know it's fantastic what the Pope does, but we must not forget that 2 years ago the Catholic Church was in a crisis of moral issues that had no parallel anywhere else. And luckily, the Church or whoever there have decided to appoint somebody who's a true leader and brings it to a whole new level. And that actually links nicely into Volkswagen, because all these words of new beginning is what the supervisory board of Volkswagen had in their statement today as well. And so let's just hope that the next Mr. CEO or Mrs. CEO is actually at a very different level and with different skill sets, the change agent to Volkswagen that the Pope is trying to be for the Catholic Church and actually in his role for the world. So I think what you often see is crises, whether it's the Catholic crisis, the country crisis that you have occasionally, or in this case the Volkswagen crisis, are also an incredible opportunity for very systemic change, and that's where we need to, in my mind, go to. But your question was, what do we think about the encyclical? So originally, the relationship between business and any religion is always, and particularly if you run a global organization like ours, is always a hard one to navigate. Because yes, it's great that the Pope make these statements, and it's right up the course of all our activities. But he's Catholic, he's not Islamic, he's not whatever other religions are out there. And so you don't want to be seen to support one and not the others. And so originally we struggled a bit, what do we do with this? But then we're working very close with Jeffrey Sachs, other university, I believe, but still relatively smart guy. Relatively smart guy on most days. And he said, well, we're really struggling, particularly in the US, to get business leaders to speak out on the encyclical. It's very quiet from the business community, and that kind of surprises us. So we said, okay, well, we need to put our weight into this game. Actually, it wasn't weight, because it's Emily who did this. And this is Emily. She's a Yaley. Is that how you call it, a Yaley? She's a Yaley. She's one of the good guys. Anyway, she pulled it off. A week ago, we started to get real serious to see what can we do to mobilize support. And it's now 96 CEOs have signed. How many countries? 15 countries around the world, 96 CEOs. And I think somebody's dreaming to get it to 1,000 soon, but 96 is pretty impressive in a week, all global company CEOs. So they are mobilizing behind the encyclical, because the call is a universal call. It's about our planet, it's about our moral responsibilities and about the changes we need. I'm sure if you ask each of these individual CEOs, are you in agreement with every statement in the encyclical, you wouldn't have gotten these signatures, because there's lots to argue for and against. But the underlying call is one that is finding broad support.
Could I just quickly say, as a compliment, Peter, the Dutch government was, of course, one of the great supporters of the Earth Charter, and Ruud Lubbers and even Queen Beatrix and so on. And when we had the Earth Charter Plus 15 in Amsterdam this summer, people were overjoyed that it was mentioned in the encyclical. Right. So a shout out to the Dutch for huge support for the
Pavan or Francis, anything you'd want to add based on comments or questions to other
The only thing I'd add is that I think that the Pope is a figure of moral authority. He happens to be responsible for the Catholic Church and the large Catholic population in the world. But there are very few figures now in the world who have that kind of moral authority. So the fact that he has it and that he's using it, not on behalf of the church, but on behalf of humanity, I think is really, really significant. I mean, we're at a point where there are just very few voices out there that get that kind of respect. And he is one of them, and the fact that he is using it for, the future of and well-being of humanity and the planet, and joining them, which we all try to do in our own way. But, he speaks from a platform that really reaches everywhere. And I think it is fantastic. I mean, always longing for who can speak that way, and there aren't very many people. And the fact that he has chosen to do it, I think is a great thing for the Earth. I really do.
Peter?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that it's a little sad that there have been attacks on why is the Pope involved in this, and someone even said this is about science, it's not about religion. Well, you know, a couple of things. One is that, and what does he know about science? This is about, and he's into religion. But actually, he has a degree in chemistry. So I would imagine he knows a lot more about this probably than some business people who do not have degrees, either physics or chemistry. But and I think to quote him, he's anticipated this in the encyclical. Here are my little few nuggets of favorite quotations from the. This is from the obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalance, resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. I think that's a very telling statement, because it shows that there's a lot of thought that's gone into the encyclical, apart from the fact that probably his first 20 paragraphs are just explaining why it is very much correct for the Pope to be engaging in this conversation. So I think we have to just respect that. And I wish you luck, Peter and Emily, that your initiative works, because I think if the number does build up, as I hope it does, then I think that would be a huge statement of a congruence of leadership between what the Pope is saying on the one hand and what responsible business is saying on the other.
Peter?
I wanted to go back to Volkswagen for a minute, because of course it's a tragedy. You know, 11 million consumers fooled, but I'm even more sad for all the employees who spent their life building cars for that brand which everybody loves, and we're all cheated in a way. But the interesting question is how did this happen? You know, is this a runaway programmer? Is this the top of the company not being honest? Is it because if you look in their strategy, they only have one strategy. We want to be the #1 car builder in the world. That's been their strategy for the last few years. And there was one quarter, I think, this year that they actually made it, but in the full year, Toyota will just still beat them. But that's their only driver, sell as many cars and more than anybody else on the planet. And that's where the share price has been based on. So I think, you know, the problem is never, is Mr. CEO a good or a bad guy, or is one of the programmers of this software a crook or not? The problem is a systemic problem. We are all, particularly in business, are all in this trap of we need to grow, because then the share price goes. And sometimes just because it's a game, sometimes because you want to make a lot of money yourself, whatever that the reasons are. But that part of the system is wrong. But we also need to ask ourselves as consumers, what is going on here? Because we all like to buy a green car. I mean, the young kids in the room maybe don't want to buy cars anymore, but my generation, we used to want to buy cars. And if you're a little bit conscious about these things, you want to buy a green car. But once you've bought it, you want to have a comfortable, pleasant car to drive, which if at the traffic light you can beat the guy next to you, you will go beat him.
That's a gender thing.
And so how much of this trick is actually because we want cars that go fast but are green when we buy them? It's another question that one can ask, and it's not as simple as an answer as there's one person bad. The one thing that I hope, I mean, there's two outcomes of this. Either, well, the real thing I hope is it's just Volkswagen. Because if tomorrow the news is that some other car companies have done the same type of tricks, then all of business will be dead, because then we're just all bad people playing the same tricks. So let's hope that that's not the case. But then there's two scenarios. Either, you know, Volkswagen is bad, their reputation is down the tube, they will sell a lot less cars, diesel engines will be out.
Dead, yes.
I mean, those are the immediate fallouts, and they will probably happen. The good outcome of it would be, why don't we treat Volkswagen as we did Enron? Enron was a tragedy. Anyone who has family, who has worked there, people have lost their livelihoods, their pensions, everything, because some greedy guys did some very bad things. But what happened after Enron is we put Sarbanes-Oxley in. We completely revised the corporate governance. And still bad things happen, because when a crook wants to beat the system, he will find a way to do it. But the system was really improved then. well, let's make this the moment that we really bring environmental and social, the natural capital protocols, the GRIs, the integrated reporting, into the governance and all the way up to the top into the responsibility. And if we can get, I'm not a religious person, which on this panel is all of a sudden a risk, I know. But I always used to say, and let's volunteer it. The universe always has a reason for whatever happens. And it's a very interesting moment that in the week that the Pope is going to go on the biggest platform he's ever going to talk about morality in relation to environment,
nice example,
that the biggest environmental fraud that the world probably has ever seen comes out. Somebody's playing a trick up there, which is, so I'm actually hoping that the good outcome, the systemic change that we need, will come out of this.
Yeah.
And so I'll answer the question before it's asked. I'm in real deep trouble at the moment because Volkswagen is a member of ours. So I've been breaking my head for 3 days. What do? The easy bit is you write a letter, I'm terminating your membership, you're bad. Boom. And in the noise that these people are in, I mean, losing 20% of their share price, they will just shrug their shoulders and say, I can feel good. Maybe I can say, oh, I threw them out. Big deal. But what is the better answer? Can I actually write them a letter saying, I will help you if this, that, and the other, the systemic change will be the result of it? So ask me again in a few days.
Speaking of asking, there's mics. I think Heather and Stuart have mics. If people could please identify themselves and say where they are in their degree program or where they're working, just so the panelists have an idea where people are coming from, that'd be great. Questions?
While that's happening, if I could just say, I think there's also a need for proactive business. And this is what I've been discussing with my brother in insurance. Why aren't there reinsurance companies, Munich Re and Swiss Re, who have on the front page of their websites what the risk of climate change is immense. They should be at the table, and companies like Chubb should be saying, you can't get coastal water insurance because they stopped insuring 10 years ago. You see, those are changes and proactive changes. In addition to divestment, which yesterday was announced from 50 billion to 2.6 trillion in 1 year. That's a 50-fold increase. So investment and divestment, I think, are great change agents.
Can I ask Peter a question also?
Sure.
Brad, so, one of under the kind of Paris COP, there are all these opportunities for business, and part is their own initiatives and joining other initiatives, and then being a voice for policy change. So the last piece, I think, has been very up and down in the business community. We were part of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, where there were a bunch of CEOs who were willing to advocate on behalf of policy, and then they fled when the policy didn't pass, and we haven't seen them since. But to me, it's one thing to say that you care deeply about these issues and you're going to do X, Y, and Z. But you do need a uniform system, whether it's country by country or globally. We do need a price on carbon. And what is your assessment of how much muscle or shoulder these companies are willing to put to get those policies in place so that everybody has to reach the same standards? It's not just the good companies that we hear about and the laggards get off scot-free. What's happening with that?
I think the one statistic I can give you, we are organizing a meeting during the COP, a business leaders meeting, CEOs coming. I have now 5 times more CEO registered than I will get passes for them into the COP center. So there's plenty CEOs who now want to be part of this. I now need to find a way to get them in the tent and to then say what they have to say. I think on policy, 2 things. Carbon pricing is my biggest concern at the moment. I have, in the last 4 weeks, I've been in Joburg, I've been in Delhi, I was in Washington yesterday, we've had a few other meetings going on. In May this year, we had 2,000 business people in the Business Climate Summit in Paris. Everybody, universally, in business says, give us a carbon price. Just tell us what it is, what the system will be, we'll find a way to work with it. At the moment in the negotiations, in the texts, it's in what is called the third pillar, which is in diplomatic language is called options for Paris. In Dutch language, it's called the dustbin. So it will not make it in the agreement in Paris, is the current read. And that's a tragedy. I mean, I wasn't, like I said, in India, which is, well, you know this, it's a completely coal-driven economy.
Yeah, India.
We had a dinner with 30-something CEOs for 2 hours. The universal outcome was we must have a price on carbon if you want to accelerate the transformation.
Yeah.
South Africa, coal-based as any country you can find, same conclusion. And then it's not going to be in the text. And I know there's not going to be a global price on carbon in that text, but at least say that the world needs this economic incentive and that countries work it out, and over time we will find a way to harmonize. Text to that language will be good enough to make the market move. For the rest, I think policy conversations will be solution specific, and that's, I think, a big gain, because talking about a generic policy is not going to help. Talking about a policy that's going to make forest carbon sinks or buildings energy efficient or whatever other solutions are out there, that's where the battle needs to be had. And that's where Paris actually looks really good, because there's, I think, 10 thematic days in the tent. One on forest and agriculture, buildings, blah, blah, blah. And in those thematic days, those policy debates can be had and will be had.
And to dwell further on that, actually those thematic days and the focus on the sector is critical, because today 3/4 of the economy is private sector. Most private sector, the big sectors, are actually hugely concentrated. So the top 10, 20 companies tend to control 80-90% of the entire sector, which means since they're all multinational and cutting across jurisdictions, there's not much point in having 2, 10 or 20 or even 50 countries have a regulation or a set of consistent regulations, because you can easily move from one location to the other. So I think the sectoral approach towards creating incentives, creating disincentives, organizing and achieving different results, I think really is, there's no choice. We have to go that route. If you need something in, as we have seen in pulp and paper, talk to the pulp and paper companies and the 4 or 5 governments who control most of them. That's it.
We should probably open up for questions from the audience. We've got about 15 minutes before we'll take a break. If you, again, name and either degree program or organization. Just wait for the mic to come, please.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My name is Garrett Wong. I'm a joint degree student at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and SOM. My question is for Peter. I was curious when you mentioned that, now that we have consensus on SDGs, it seemed like your organization was focused on bringing corporations and the private sector into that discussion. Now that there is consensus, how is your organization planning to reprioritize or position itself to begin to focus on them? Because as you mentioned, there are 17. So which ones are your top priorities, and which ones do you think business have the greatest opportunities to contribute to?
Yeah, we anticipated the SDGs in a piece of work that we did 2 years ago called Action 2020. Because our chairman is Paul Polman from Unilever. He was in the high-level panel that gave input to Ban Ki-moon and the UN process. Myself, I'm in SDSN with Jeff Sachs. We gave our input into it. So through those 2 channels, we had a pretty good read of the type of targets and goals that would make it. And, I think we landed on 10, Paul landed on 12, it's now 17, but the topics were kind of known. So we created a piece of work which is called Action 2020, 9 big sustainability priorities. The one where we have no answers, if I'm totally honest, is on peace. I'm sure business has a role to play, but we haven't worked out what our role in that would be. And the one where we are very light on answers, which I think is something we need to address, but is on oceans. We're not deep enough into oceans, kind of. The rest we will all cover through these 9. We're now having internal debates. Do we change our we call these 9 priorities clusters. Do we change the cluster structure and call them SDGs? But then you immediately get that once you start thinking through solutions, there's no solution for climate change that does not touch on water or on land use or on. So yes, in some ways the SDGs are a very good framework. In other ways, they're a little bit at risk of causing silos, which from a solution point of view won't work. So that's the technical debate we now have. That we'll work that out in the next few weeks. The big other thing we will do is make it as easy as possible for businesses, and we will work with the large ones we will work with, but the tools will be available to all, to engage with the SDGs which are relevant and material to them. Because again, I think I said it in my introduction, there's no business person who knows what to do with 169 targets. You know, I know from my own experience, if you give me more than 3 targets, I get really confused and big headaches. And so what do I do? So let's bring this down to something that is manageable. Let's agree a language, and that's why this SDG compass that we have built with GRI and with the Global Compact is so important, because GRI knows how to drive these standards or these indicators into standards. So if all businesses start using that framework, and we should, Pavan and I were on the same page there. Yes, we need to build the systems, the natural capital, and all these things now, but as soon as we can, and preferably within 5 years, they should all be mandatory accounting principles that are being driven in, so that every business will use the same framework. The numbers can be consolidated, and together somewhere a system can keep track on, are we making progress on all the SDGs, or are some falling behind, and do we need to do more? The biggest question, and there we start touching the morality again, every company, and I haven't thought this through academically, but every company will have 1 or 2 natural touch points. If you're in the agri business, it's hunger and it's land use or water, whatever. You know, if you're in the energy business, it's the energy one. If you're in buildings, it's cities. But how do we avoid that business only looks into the natural one? How do we make sure that, whether it's from a responsibility point of view or a moral point of view, everybody touches more than just the obvious opportunistic one? That's I think, where most thought needs to go into.
Another question?
I would just like to say, again, you know, the New York Review of Books has an article by William Nordhaus on the Pope and the market. And he's an economist here at Yale, as you know. In the week before that, there's one of Joseph Stiglitz and his position on markets and so on. And basically, Nordhaus is arguing, well, markets are fair, markets won't really cause a problem, and so on, whereas Stiglitz is arguing on the other side and saying there are many imperfections, which I think we're all acknowledging here, Volkswagen being one. So, and then Nordhaus says what's needed for ethical behavior is to behave as responsible members of the market community, to earn and pay, not steal and cheat. To be responsible members of the market community. I think it's to be responsible members of the Earth community.
Yes.
And the market is a subsystem of the Earth community. And that's the difference here. That is the difference. It's going to take a while to move in that direction. I think there's lots of positive signs, but you have to think of the Earth community.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Thank you. My name is Ben Cashore, and I'm a political scientist here in this school. I do work a lot on business and the environment from the perspective of certification systems and also pathways to decarbonization involving coalitions of businesses and NGOs. But I want to actually ask a provocative question, because we are in a university setting. And so here's the question. In international relations theory, there's a subdiscipline which argues that the key problem in addressing environmental problems globally has been, in the last 20 years, a shift towards market mechanisms and business-friendly approaches that don't actually have the ability to address the real challenges that, for example, Francis' story on the EPA and Volkswagen did. This is a command and control well-resourced agency from the 1970s that did something that market mechanisms didn't do. So my question is, thinking about even 10 years ago, I was at a wonderful workshop at Terry where you had Bjorn Stigson, who was WBCSD's previous head. You had climate talk like this one, great people talking about norms and values and business interests, saying we've got to do things differently. And 10 years later, we're doing things probably even worse, not better. So my question is to Peter, how would you answer that group in political science that argues that even though these are well-intended efforts, they lock in pretty modest efforts. So the focus is on carbon price, not a price that's low enough to address the problem. And my curiosity is, would one solution be to get WBCSD members in the U.S. to maintain membership by agreeing to support NRDC's domestic climate legislative reform agenda, which is, one would argue, very, very much purposeful. So some random provocative questions and thoughts.
Good. Well, I don't know the NDRC well enough to make a comment on that. What came up when you talked is, I'm not so sure the market does or doesn't work. I'm pretty sure we haven't found a better system. What we have not done well enough, I mean, basically what we're doing, and Volkswagen is unfortunately a great example, is the more externalities we are able to create, the more successful the market will make us. So the more we do not pay for or tell the world that we are actually poisoning them with our cars or whatever it may be, we just fool them, the more cars we will sell, and then one day we'll be number one and our share price will be higher than everybody else. So for me, giving up on the market, I will not be prepared to do until after we have included all the externalities. Because, and the externalities for carbon is a carbon price. And it needs to be $100 a ton, if you ask me, not $3 a ton, because that's where we need to move to. But the same applies to water. The same applies to social injustice, to any other of the other SDG issues. As long as we can get away exporting jobs to low labor cost countries and not caring about the health and the safety of the girls in Bangladesh, and killing jobs in America or Europe or wherever you export them from, because we don't pay the price for that. Right. We're not even responsible for these girls dying because it's a subcontractor of a subcontractor of something legally far away. On purpose. But those are the externalities we have to internalize in the system, and not because we're responsible business leaders and Mr. Polman is a better guy than Mr. Winterkorn, but because it's in the accounting principles. I've been a CEO and I've been a CFO for a long time. I've done 1,000 roadshows. I never ever had the question, Peter, you're presenting this revenue number this quarter. Can you tell me how you calculated revenue? How did you actually make up this EBIT number? What did you do? No, there's a rule. And you can cook your books to make the rule not work, but then you go to jail. Well, the same needs to happen with your environmental and your social impact.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's just no debate. This is how you calculate it. Boom, that's the number, and we'll judge you on the number. Once you do that, then I think the market will be educated to include that in your valuation. That's where we need to go.
I mean, completely agree with what Peter said. We are in a world where it's okay to have private profits, public losses. Private profits, public losses. And that disconnect and that disparity, as anyone knows, cannot go on forever. You just cannot keep doing that. And yet today's system permits exactly that to happen. So it's not that, maybe when Peter says a number, you mean a set of metrics, because we need to look at not just the pure economics. I mean, you can't attach a price to life. You can't attach a price to the risk of loss of life. But you can definitely count those numbers dead, or the numbers whose health has been put at risk. And you can do that as well as work out the health costs of curing them. So I think the dimensionality that GRI and others have brought to the table remains, but I think it's very important to get to the point where there are standards, there are guidelines, and there is a regulatory demand to publish. Right. Without disclosure, there will be nothing. And the more that we have organizations and groups arguing that you don't need disclosure, I think the more foolish we appear, frankly.
Mary Evelyn or Francis, would you like to weigh in on this? Because I think this will be our last question and then some closing comments.
No, I would just agree totally. I think Ben has it right. We're certainly not there, and Peter and Pavan are very optimistic that we're going to get there, but there is a gap between. And, meanwhile, the conditions both to people and to the planet are deteriorating very, very rapidly. So, that gets back to the kind of the original premise of this. Both the SDGs and COP21 are a framework that if I think adhered to and committed to, can lead to an acceleration that we need to get to. And we're just not there. The systems don't allow it. There's so much more work to be done. But this is a moment in time, and I think it is a positive one, but it doesn't get the planet or the well-being of humanity to where we need to go. Just won't get us there yet.
Mary Evelyn?
Thank you. I want to come back to a figure that Pavan mentioned of the top 10 companies in the world having 80% and more of the world's business share. We haven't really talked about inequity sufficiently here, and we can say Occupy put a 1% into the human consciousness here in the US and so on. But I want to also put into this conversation, whether markets work or not with externalities, I agree with Peter's point to a long term. But we've got to say, these inequities are massive and are not going to go away with certain larger shifts than just market mechanisms. That's a suggestion. These are necessary but not sufficient. And I'd like to just end in this wonderful School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and these terrific students that we so love teaching. I think the environmental movement in many ways, some of which came out of here, was founded on two wonderful streams. And I would suggest one of them, founder of our school, Gifford Pinchot, wise use. The largest number benefiting out of forest management and so on. But another stream of the environmental movement, and is well known because he wrote magnificently about the West and Yosemite that he saved and founded the Sierra Club, and that's John Muir. And that is an aesthetic and a spiritual sensibility about nature, which we have got to put together with a sense of wise use, because that brings all humans into this conversation. So John Muir and Gifford Pinchot together, I think.
That's probably a nice debate around which to continue discussions, but if you would join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. That was fun. I got to read some books.